It is Sunday, November the 17th, 2019. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, the Corn Pone KGB, Cotton Patch Gestapo, the Gulf Coast Goonery of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, a little examined straight up fascist organization from the 60s and 70s in Mississippi. We'll talk about it today. Of course, before I get to all that stuff, just a brief reminder that today's show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons. There's also a PayPal link at paypal.me/distantpeasant where you can make a one-time donation to the efforts of this program. Please and thank you for your contributions, which I do rely upon. Had a bit of technical difficulty getting this up in terms of internet access, and some arguments with my production assistant as to the exact amount of squeaky toy that should be included in the show. We've got all that worked out. I appreciate your patience. Don't like to go so long between episodes. Just want to let you know that up top. Thanks for indulging me. On with the show. In 1969, Byron de la Beckwith had officially gotten away with murder. Not in a poetic or a metaphorical sense, but literally. With his heart full of both malice and purpose, he planned to kill, and then did kill, Medgar Evers, shooting him through the back with a bolt-action rifle on the morning of June 12, 1963 in Jackson, Mississippi. Evers was the NAACP's field secretary for the state, and in addition to being a courageous fighter for civil rights and integration, he was also a clever and curious man who wasn't just organizing, but had gotten a reputation as something of an investigator into lynchings and threats by the Ku Klux Klan and white citizens' councils towards the state's black community. He was even in the process of taking statements for use in a court of law concerning a shadowy and little explored government body's role in this intimidation when he was killed. The crime took no innovative police work to solve. The murder weapon was recovered with Beckwith's fingerprints all over the site. Witnesses reported seeing a man who looked just like Beckwith in the vicinity. A car just like his white Plymouth Valiant was spotted in the neighborhood as well. Beckwith was well known to be a passionate segregationist and couldn't have hidden his vitriolic white supremacy even if he were inclined to try. His only defenses were that the rifle was stolen and two crooked cops who said they saw him somewhere else when the murder happened. Yet in 1969, charges against him were dismissed. Twice the state of Mississippi had brought him to trial, and twice an all-white, all-male jury had deadlocked. During the second trial, the former governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, shook hands with Beckwith, as Merle Evers, widow of the slain Medgar, was testifying. Such was the climate in which these white jurors would not convict the murderer of a black man in 1964. No matter what the evidence. That handshake was a powerful gesture, a crude but effective symbol of the commitment politicians had to defending segregation and white supremacy. Barnett communicated in one small act that not only should the victims and survivors of this terrorism be ignored, but that the perpetrators of that terrorism deserved an attaboy. But beyond the realm of symbols, in fact, some held that perpetrators like Beckwith deserved something far more tangible than just an amiable handshake. Among them were people at the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, the very same organization Medgar Evers was beginning to sniff around the edges of when he was murdered. This government agency, part clearinghouse and coordinating hub for resistance to integration, part propaganda firm, part secret intelligence body, for the better part of 2 decades, did much work to earn Mississippi an infamous reputation as one of the most reactionary and violent states of the Union. Yet most people have never heard of it. Its records, well, the ones they didn't destroy anyway, have only been available to scholars for about a generation, and haven't been accessible through the internet for much of that time. As such, only a couple books have been written about this commission, which had over 87,000 different people profiled during its existence. And among the slimy things it did was to provide invaluable assistance to Beckwith's attorneys during jury selection for his second criminal trial. This assistance, publicly funded of course, ensured in a very direct sense Beckwith's freedom in 1969. His charges were being dropped because convicting him had proven impossible. Convicting him had proven impossible because no assembled jury would vote him guilty. No assembled jury would vote him guilty, in part, because the state of Mississippi had assisted Beckwith's counsel in screening out anyone who might convict a white man of murdering a black civil rights activist. Straight-ass line, if you ask me, and all quite illegal. It's all well and good to think about and know about the more ephemeral and distant causes for such a society like Mississippi's existence. The legacies of slavery, genocide, colonialism, industrial capitalism, all this and more, brings things to such a head. But these often manifest in more concrete ways, and most importantly, ways that are easy to imagine being otherwise. It wouldn't have fixed everything, obviously, yet in ways big and small, if such jury tampering hadn't occurred in Mississippi, that state and even the United States as a whole would be that much further down the road to realizing a more equal country, to say nothing of maybe letting some black people serve on such a jury, which they weren't allowed to at the time. The just conviction of terrorist Byron Dale Beckwith could have been a step in the right direction either way, I think. It's certainly hard to imagine it hurting things worse than letting him skate. The assholes partially responsible for this state of affairs down at the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission will be what we talk about today. For though this was among the most famous incidents they had their hands in, it was far from the only one. Now, fascism is ever a slippery beast, manifesting and emphasizing somewhat different features here or there, but it nearly always relies heavily on both propaganda and a police state. And I'd say that this commission is one of the most fascist government organizations there's ever been in the United States. Its buffoonish efforts were, on the whole, less effective in total than your typical fascist societies, true. But there's more than an inkling of the present that we live in today in this story. Fascists, or if that's too specific, authoritarian right-wingers anyway, often seem like ridiculous goofs to outsiders, and always have. They're very funny till very suddenly they aren't, when they get their mettle up enough to protect their carefully manufactured fantasies. I'm rather grateful that this cornpone KGB wasn't more successful and well run, of course, but they did leave their mark upon our world, occasionally in blood, and are worth some examination. The commission itself is legally dead and has been for quite a while, but the ideals and constituency it represented are still very much with us. What's more, its methods were at times eerily similar to those of our present day, when watch lists are back in vogue, cops constantly on the lookout for radical political extremists, and surveillance so pervasive as to appear unchallengeable to millions. Once upon a time in 1954, the wheels of justice creaked a bit and moved just an inch. I'm no lawyer or legal scholar, but that's the way I'd put it, for that's the year the United States budged just a little and took a tiny step towards fulfilling some fragment of its lofty rhetoric about liberty and equality, and more practically starting to grow some goddamn baby teeth onto the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Oliver Brown et al. Appellants v. Board of Education of Topeka, Shawnee County, Kansas et al. consolidated with 5 other cases and usually just called Brown v. Board of Education, traditionally heralded as a momentous decision, framed by a great deal of political maneuvering behind the scenes of the court, and the end of the idea that separate racially segregated public facilities could be even theoretically equal under our Constitution. None of that's wrong exactly, but the reason I call it a tiny step that I declare we moved barely but perceptively in the right direction as a country is because this decision did not achieve even the limited equality in the arena it was directly dealing with at the time, public schools. Massive resistance to integration continued for decades, unhampered by a federal government that was incredibly reluctant to ride hard on recalcitrant segregationists, and courts whose decisions and appeals could take years to settle. Indeed, it's not too far to say the problem continues up to the present day, where de facto segregation still rules a great many schools, to say nothing of other spheres like housing and employment. However momentous an occasion you consider it is probably greatly related to your respect for this thing called the law, but however disenchanted with the legal system of the United States I am, I'll never lose my poet's heart. Laws made of words, and words have power. The decision was and remains a powerful symbol for many folk with a yearning for justice and equality in the world, and especially at the time of its handing down, an equally powerful symbol for those opposed to all that. Amidst this atmosphere, Mississippi proved the most militant and dangerous cesspools of reaction. In 1955, the following year, marked the election of a new governor. 5 contenders vied for the Democratic nod in the primary, which is the only contest that mattered that cycle, the general being a foregone conclusion in the solid South. And it went to a runoff. All candidates, of course, pledged complete and absolute fealty to preserving segregation in Mississippi, with particular attention paid to its schools. But the winner was a man named James P. Coleman, considered to be a moderate by his contemporaries, though he personally objected to that label, so total was his commitment to white supremacy. I will actually give that he was a moderate in his time and place, that this label is fitting for him, and that just goes to show you how goddamn useless moderates can be when the lines are drawn. One of his first acts as governor in 1956 was to sign the papers that created the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, amidst a torrent of bills and resolutions passing in the State House. The mood was one of overwhelming defiance and resistance to integration, with a parade of hateful blowhards, each seeking to be seen as the most defiant. Now, the legislation establishing the commission very carefully avoided mentioning either segregation or integration, and doesn't even mention race, but instead gave it broad powers to, quote, do and perform any and all acts and things deemed necessary and proper to protect the sovereignty of the state of Mississippi, end quote, from, quote, encroachment by the federal government or any branch, department, or agency thereof, end quote. It's an ominous-sounding mandate to my ears. What's worse, for the record, other southern states, including Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama, all had similar bodies, though none were as active and large as Mississippi's. Lasting into the 1970s, this commission inevitably shifted its priorities somewhat as different actors directed it, but it was barely any time at all before its twin missions of propaganda and domestic surveillance began to manifest. Now, this was also the high Cold War, of course, so targets of the commission were described as subversives or even just, quote, the enemy. In the collection of partly random, partly bizarre, partly useful information they accumulated called intelligence, one of its first acts was to send hundreds of thousands of direct mailings north of the Mason-Dixon line, some with messages in the vein of segregationist apologetics, some with more positive and glowing messages about life in segregated Mississippi. When selling people bullshit, it's best to cover it in different flavors. These efforts would expand by the 1960s to hundreds of speaking tours and even a film, Message from Mississippi, which was not about defending racial segregation so much as encouraging it. Other propaganda efforts were more shadowy. They would frequently fund alternative organizations and leaders in Mississippi's black community who defended racial segregation, as well as white organizations, citizens' councils. But as for co-opting black leadership, They would bribe people. People like H. Humes, who edited a paper called Greenville Delta Leader, who was president of the Negro State Baptist Convention, and wrote that his proud race was distinct, that separate schools for whites and blacks in Greenville were, quote, the same, penny for penny, end quote, who railed against Northern agitators, and who was a strong proponent of accommodating segregationists, and who claimed to live in a society where, as he put it, the black man, quote, gets justice in the courts and has his own swimming pool, the same as white, his own Negro policeman, and his own Negro welfare worker, end quote. He may have really believed all that. I actually think that he probably did. But the money the state of Mississippi paid him certainly didn't hurt. Far more widespread than this was the public and private work it did. Now, though the agency was incredibly dependent upon paid informants and never mustered more than a couple full-time investigators at any point, it did manage to create a repository and network of response to any challenge to the status quo in Mississippi. In fact, even vaguely liberal notions, any behavior out of the ordinary whatsoever, tenuous associations with someone could get your name in a secret file somewhere. I opened specifically with its efforts in assisting the assassin of Medgar Evers' defense in screening the jury pool. But they also infiltrated churches, law offices, and civil rights organizations to an incredible degree. Now, their information was usually secondhand at best, and often bizarre and useless, but taken all together, it was usually enough to vaguely warn the white establishment of where and when any challenges to institutionalized segregation might occur. The commission was aware, for example, that James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwimmer were trying to hold a campaign to register African Americans to vote in 1964, and passed along what information it had regarding the three to Neshoba County law enforcement. Most helpfully, some license plate numbers. They also suggested that the disappearance of the three men would be helpful. The pigs of Neshoba County must have agreed. They pulled over the three on some speeding bullshit, and I mean bullshit. They were arrested for going 65 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour zone with a flat tire. The three were then taken to lockup and held for a few hours. Their comrades at headquarters began calling every jail and police station in the area to inquire as to their whereabouts. The jail that held the three lied to them about it. They were finally fined and told to get out of the county, but as they drove away, they were followed by many, including a sheriff's deputy who stopped them and escorted them back the ways they came. All three men, 2 white and 1 black, were shot and killed. James Chaney, the local and a black man, was beaten badly first. This event is usually just called the Freedom Summer Murders. And while there were many, many hands in the conspiracy to kill the three men, it shouldn't be forgotten that this murder wasn't simply one of private citizens going full-on KKK while the cops watched, or even just the activities of local government officials and law enforcement, who were often themselves members of the KKK, or white citizens' councils, or whatever. The state of Mississippi itself was complicit too. This is a commission that legally was controlled by 12 appointed and legislatively selective members, as well as 4 seats reserved for the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the state house, and the state attorney general. Mississippi's clear and unambiguous involvement in the extrajudicial murder of these 3 men has never been adjudicated in any court of law as far as I am aware. But the historical record speaks for itself. Mississippi's efforts to bring justice amounted to exactly 1 man being convicted of manslaughter related to the incident. He was 80 years old when he was sentenced to 3 consecutive 20-year terms. He died just shy of 93 years old. No other prosecutions for the murders will be happening, let alone any other trials or hearings on what the state of Mississippi's level of responsibility is for these murders. This tragedy already has many books and even movies about it, though, so let's zoom in on a struggle that's not so well tried. As a kid, growing up, I would go visit my grandparents, as is pretty common, and both sets of mine lived in Biloxi, Mississippi. It's not a big town, the smaller of the 2 county seats in Harrison County, along with Gulfport. It's never been much bigger than 50,000 people. even less so after Hurricane Katrina came through in 2005. But I tell you, it's got great food, gambling, and some nice beaches. As for those beaches, of course, to Mother Nature, our first salute is always due, but if we're being fair, the United States Army Corps of Engineers in the 50s also did a fair amount of work too to make those beaches nice, all publicly funded, of course. Quite logically, that public included some non-white people. And on May 14th, 1959, Gilbert R. Mason and some of his friends and their families wanted to use that beach, a beach that is to this day still abutted by the Jefferson Davis home and presidential library called the Beauvoir Estate, beautiful to look upon. Dr. Mason was black, and the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission amassed over 100 pages in documents, news clippings, and memos where he is mentioned. Anyway, while they were at the beach, policemen came down, told them to leave. Dr. Mason and a partner went to the police station and asked what law segregated the beaches. Nobody could show them one. They returned the next day and were told, look, all you need to know is that if you try to use the beach, you're going to be arrested. Without the support of any state or national organization, there is no local NAACP at this time, Dr. Mason and the others began an organized effort to challenge this state of affairs. He and 3 other black men, including a Dr. Felix Dunn, first formally petitioned the government to allow them unrestrained access to the beaches. All of it. The commission responded immediately by investigating their jobs, credit histories, marriages, associations. The other 2 signers lost their jobs and withdrew their names from the petition immediately, but the 2 doctors, Dunn and Mason, less directly vulnerable to white economic pressure, held fast. The next season in 1960, Dr. Mason and Dr. Dunn both went to the beach to enjoy it. Both were arrested. Dr. Mason was charged as a repeat offender. Dr. Dunn, quote, given a talking to, end quote, as it was put at the time anyway, but not charged, as this was his first offense. Or maybe it was because the commission, along with the local sheriff, had been in communication with Dr. Dunn, who was reporting on Mason's activities, and who was rewarded with an unrestricted market for a company he was part owner in that dealt in jukeboxes, slot machines, and cigarette machines. A week later, a larger protest of hundreds of black people gathered on the beach. Thousands of angry whites watched them, including the cops. In fact, the Biloxi Police Department, in contact with the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission on this matter, as in all matters related to segregation in Mississippi, had organized this mob themselves. They didn't just look away when the violence began, they facilitated the violence. 2 people were beaten to death, one so badly his head was nearly decapitated. Many were hit with chains, pipes, pieces of lumber. Dozens were hospitalized, 8 were shot, many more arrested, including Dr. Mason himself, whose office was also firebombed. Fighting continued in the streets for days. I can find no evidence that any white people were ever convicted of any crimes related to this event. No convictions, charges, or even arrests. This was the immediate catalyst for the formation of the first Biloxi chapter of the NAACP. Literally, the protest was on the 24th of April, 1960. The chapter formed the next day, headed by Dr. Mason, naturally. It also roused that slumbering beast known as Uncle Sam's Justice Department. And just a few weeks later, it filed suit against the city of Biloxi, demanding free access to nationally funded beaches for all citizens of the United States, including the non-white ones. But you know how slumbering beasts are. When they wake up, they move slow. And after that season, and then another, and then another, no resolution was in sight. In June of 1963, another protest was planned. Before he was murdered, Medgar Evers wrote to Dr. Mason, quote, if we are to receive a beating, let's receive it because we have done something, not because we have done nothing, end quote. He was murdered shortly thereafter. 2 weeks were set aside for mourning his murder before the protest resumed. Black flags commemorating his martyrdom were placed in the sand. not far from the shadow of the Beauvoir. A whiff of hope surrounded the mayor, who had been elected with some black votes, and who said he wanted a peaceful demonstration supervised by the police. What happened instead was not exactly that. While the police did some work restraining violence against the demonstrators, who were not all black this time, I would add, dozens of people were still beaten. Mason's car was toppled over. This third go-round, 71 protesters were arrested. No effective retribution for violent reaction by some of Mississippi's white community was ever enacted, and the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission was there the whole time, coordinating meetings, sharing information, discussing plans, running interference. Here's one example, a memo dated May 4th, 1960, after the second effort to integrate the beaches was suppressed. Memo 2, File 5-4, from Zach J. Van Landingham. Subject, Beach Integration, Harrison County, Mississippi. At approximately 1:30 p.m. on April 28, 1960, Dr. Felix Dunn, Negro head of the NAACP, Harrison County, Mississippi, together with his white attorney, Mr. Knox Walker and Mr. Knapp Cassaberry, appeared in the office of the State Sovereignty Commission and wanted to have a conference with Bob Thomas and the writer with reference to the recent race riot at Biloxi, Mississippi, and to explore the possibility of resolving the tense racial situation along the Mississippi Gulf Coast brought on by Negroes attempting to swim and use the beaches. In the beginning, I explained to those present the purpose of the Sovereignty Commission in attempting to resolve any racial difficulties which appeared in the state. I pointed out that there was no reason for any attempted discussion of integration on the beaches, as any integration attempt in the state of Mississippi was contrary to the laws of this state. I further pointed out that I had been to the Gulf Coast during the summer and fall of 1959 for the express purpose of attempting to reach a solution to the same question that has arisen concerning the Negroes' use of the beach, and that a plan had been worked out with the Board of Supervisors and other officials along the Gulf Coast whereby a separate beach would be constructed for the Negroes at a cost of $50,000 to $60,000, and that they could use this area set aside for them and police themselves, set up their own rules and regulations. The Board of Supervisors had desired a statement from Dr. Felix Dunn and Dr. Gilbert Mason, the two leaders of the NAACP in Harrison County, to the effect that this would be satisfactory with them, and that they would not continue in any efforts to push their petition to integrate the entire beach. I further pointed out that I had talked to Dr. Mason, who had rebuffed the idea of setting aside a separate beach for the Negroes, and had stated that he would agree only to complete an unrestricted use of the beach for Negroes. I further stated that I had appeared at Dr. Dunn's office and gone in to see him with reference to this matter, and that he had told me to wait in his reception room until he could see me. I waited some 15 minutes or more while he took several patients, and that it appeared he was going to take all the patients before seeing me, which would have consumed possibly 1.5 to 2 hours, and I, therefore, left. End quote. First off, ha 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 for making him wait. That incident and much else is recorded in previous memos, of course. There are dozens just on this incident alone. Anyway, after, quote, all members present agreed that there was no use in discussing integration of the beaches, Dr. Dunn maintained that he did not want integration of the beaches, but all he was after was that a set policy be established upon the entire Gulf Coast with reference to the use of the beaches, and, quote, then it goes on. Quote, Dunn admitted that he is the head of the NAACP in Harrison County, and that Dr. Gilbert Mason is under him. He claimed that Dr. Mason is the only member of the NAACP residing at Biloxi. Dunn claimed that he could make Dr. Mason do what they decided should be done. He also stated that he considered this a local matter, and that he was not for bringing in the NAACP from New York or any other place into the proceedings. Then, skipping ahead a bit, quote, Dr. Dunn was asked why it was that he, as head of the NAACP in Harrison County, was opposed to integration, when the NAACP had a set policy of pushing integration. He tried to explain this by saying that he was for integration in every other field of endeavor, such as school and so forth, but he was not in favor of integrating the beaches. He could never satisfactorily explain why he was opposed to complete integration of the beaches. However, during the rest of the conference, it subsequently came out that considerable economic pressure is being brought to bear on Dr. Dunn, and he stands to lose $43,000 as he explained in an outside endeavor, unless this racial situation is resolved satisfactorily. He, therefore, is willing to give up the idea of complete integration of the beaches and accept set spots for the use of the beach by Negroes in the 4 Gulf Coast cities in exchange for assistance in his economic problem. Skipping ahead last time, quote, Hudson Puckett and Clyde Collins had set out to break Dunn by raiding all the Negro places where his music boxes and cigarette machines are set up. They arrested the operators, charging them with illegal possession and selling of liquor. According to Dunn, these operators then filed charges with the sheriff against the 2 constables, charging that they were extorting money out of them. According to Dunn, these operators have for some time in the past had to pay money to these 2 constables. Dunn claims that he is not in any type of partnership arrangements with Sheriff Dudahl. He claims that the sheriff does not own any money or shares in his corporation. This has been controverted by numerous individuals on the Gulf Coast, including, confidentially, District Attorney Boyce Holman. It has also been contended that Sheriff Dudahl campaigned during last summer to get the Negro boats by promising them that they could use the beaches. As the conference progressed, it was very evident that the $43,000 which Dunn claims he stood to lose was the primary purpose why he and his attorney had come to Jackson to confer with the State Sovereignty Commission. The matter of Negro use of the beaches appeared to be of secondary importance. Without coming out right and saying so, both he and his attorney desired the Sovereignty Commission to take some action in having the local authorities ease up on the pressure on Dr. Dunn, with reference to his jukeboxes and cigarette vending machines being placed in certain places run by Negroes. Dunn expressed the opinion that there was a very explosive situation on the Gulf Coast, and that he feared there would be bloodshed unless something was done at once. He and his attorney suggested that a meeting be called by the Sovereignty Commission, inviting the mayors and chiefs of police of Long Beach, Gulf Coast, Pass Christian, and Biloxi to meet, end quote. The memo concludes, quote, I told Dr. Dunn that we firmly believed that this matter should be handled within the state, without any outsiders coming in. That if he permitted outsiders to come in and take over, that we would not work in any way with him, end quote. I hope you get the picture. But the reason I give you this little microscopic vision is to give you a sense of the mission and tools of the Sovereignty Commission, shitty as their intel often was, because much of what I just read you is not true. Dunn was in partnership with the sheriff, but Dr. Mason was not underneath him. Regardless, this was a state-sponsored effort with broad police powers, a public relations mission, and no hesitations about utilizing targeted violence, misinformation, and intimidation, even if their influence was felt most often through other actors. Fascist societies are nearly always characterized by twin obsessions: embracing tradition, rejecting modernism. The past is idealized, its blemishes and contradictions melted away by myth or absorbed syncretically, despite any internal or external contradiction, of course. But inevitably, a society that functions on these grounds will have to rely upon a police state, complete with domestic intelligence, surveillance, and suppression of any challenge whatsoever to this vision, to say nothing of perpetuating that vision through propaganda efforts. This commission was never as developed or efficient as it might have been, of course, but from 1956 to its de facto end, in 1973, the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission did both of those things. And I'd say it's a pretty fucking fascist beast. And what's disturbing about that is how similar it was to today's state and local law enforcement organizations. Our federal government keeps records on what they call black identity extremists, or at least they did, and seem very reluctant to hand over any records on the category, to choose just one example. Pages and pages of lists and information on protesters at Standing Rock, Occupy Wall Street participants, supporters of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement for Palestine, so-called radical Islamists. All these do exist. Much of it is full of bullshit, just like the commission, and there are plenty of names whose existence on that list is an error based on mistake or misunderstanding. Many of these records are nothing more than lists of people who may or may not have been arrested for a crime once that may or may not have been related to radical political views in a country where something like a quarter of the entire population has an arrest record, from the newest babe to the oldest sage. That's true today of law enforcement, and a lot of that was true when the commission was around. They are ridiculous looking too, still. Constantly speaking of tactical situations and orderly compliance with the law while appearing as overfed stormtroopers or crisp-suited homunculi. Often stupid, or at least literally minded, and much of what they think and say about the world is just wrong. Their jobs are impossible. What they want is impossible. They are on a journey without any possible end but nihilism. These cops and lawyers live to struggle because they're always besieged, and their ultimate triumph is always reached for but never reached. I have no doubt that this mindset pervades many a brain at the Departments of Justice, of Defense, even of State, but also the brains of many a sheriff and police chief who are insulated from democratic pressures under our system. In fact, I tend to think such worldviews will always manifest more in such places, like a soldier who can only see the world through prisms of violence, conflict, and hierarchy. Overcoming all this is a tall order. The fact that our institutions themselves cultivate a mindset that is incompatible with democracy, and it's not a problem I'm sure anyone has a complete solution for, but I do believe that at the very least, it'd be a very good idea to try to limit the influence of such people in the halls of power, reduce their outsized numbers and budgets, and never look to such people for wisdom in politics. There's one final parallel I want to talk about between this defender of order, the Commission, and our modern Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, etc. Though the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission lost its budget in 1973 and legally disbanded in 1977, it took decades to gain access to its records. In fact, we almost don't have any of them at all, as there was a very strong feeling among many state officials at the time that the records should all be destroyed, just as many of the memos detailing counter-efforts against black voter registration were destroyed after passage of the National Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Stupidly, they didn't destroy all the memo copies that directed this destruction, which is how we know it happened. Anyway, in the end, the compromise seemed to be no destruction, but lock and key until 2027, anyway. And for years, court cases dragged on to get the files opened. And they finally were in 1998. A few years would pass before they were made available online. Before that, though, leaks about the files continued apace, and due in part to evidence that the state of Mississippi, through the commission, had assisted Beckwith's attorneys in screening the jury pool, he was tried a third time for his murder of Medgar Evers in 1994. The physical evidence presented to the jury was essentially the same as in the previous trials. The only addition was a few witnesses to his boasting in the years since he committed the murder. He was finally found guilty of first-degree murder. Need brooks no delay, yet late is better than never, a better writer once recorded. But it also shouldn't be forgotten that there were not a few people who would have preferred us to never know about any of that. If they'd gotten what they wanted, instead of dying in prison, Beckwith could have lived out his remaining days in peace in the mountains of Tennessee. When the state of Georgia started receiving questions about its electronic voting system in a court of law in 2016, the technicians responsible for curating the system deleted all of the electronic evidence, accidentally. Those technicians answered to the Secretary of State at the time, Brian Kemp, who of course had nothing to do with that deletion or with any fraud that definitely did not happen in the later 2018 election that made him governor. I kid, of course. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in 2017 formally started making the case and seeking approval to delete records of abuse and human rights violations of their officers. The FBI has quietly deleted lots of records for no discernible reason. Sure, the excuse of that's super classified or would affect national security if it got out is always lying in the corner. But if you want many of the files in its sex deviates list, more than 330,000 of them have already been destroyed. And if you can explain to me how not knowing who the feds were keeping tabs on for doing butt stuff is related to national security, let me know. This kind of thing happens a lot. And the more you read about a phenomenon happening in the news or a book, the more you can be sure you're looking at a metaphorical iceberg. What people notice them hiding or destroying is surely a small fraction of the actual hiding and destroying these men of honor perpetrate. The Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission doesn't exist anymore, but its spirit still haunts us and ever will, sustained first and foremost by the secrecy of those who serve it. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I could go further. I could get a little bit more conspiratorially minded. Because the truth is that if you feel like someone's watching you all the time, they kind of are. But maybe we'll dive into a little bit of that next time. I'm sorry for the delay in getting this episode out. Again, patreon.com/distantpeasant, paypal.me/distantpeasant. Please and thank you for your support. I do need it. See you